don't have an EpiPen, and as any parent knows, or if any person needs it, this is a life-saving medicine. But I think there's a need for a real rethinking of how the system works.
A lot of these products are sourced outside of Canada and therefore are outside of our regulatory process.
In Canada, because we still have a reasonably robust supply of other drugs, we can compensate at the physician's office.
From the Zoomerplex in historic Liberty Village, the Zoomer with Libby Znaimer.
Welcome to the Zoomer. I'm Libby Znaimer. Canadians have been hit by a series of drug recalls. Everything from common high blood pressure drugs to over-the-counter heartburn medicine has been taken off the shelves due to potentially cancer-causing chemicals. This comes on top of regular manufacturing shortages and now supply chain disruptions because of COVID-19. We'll discuss just how safe our drug supply system is and what you need to know if there's a problem with your prescription. But before we dive in, let's tee up the topic.
They went from world's best-selling drugs to being pulled from the market. First, it was numerous blood pressure drugs. Next were recalls for a popular over-the-counter heartburn medicine. And then came a national recall for certain types of diabetes meds, all due to concerns over links to cancer. Adding salt to the wound, the coronavirus is causing global medicine shortages as China's factories close its supply chains. Which begs the question, going forward, is Canada's drug supply safe?
Well, one thing these recalls have in common is NDMA, a potentially dangerous cancer-causing chemical. How widespread is this, and have we learned how this gets into the manufacturing process, and what's being done to prevent future recalls for the same reason? Let's start with Dean. Hi.
Hi, Libby. Yeah, NDMA, 6 months ago, I don't think most pharmacists knew what it was. Now it's a commonplace word because, we've now had three major medications recalled because of the same compound. And, the unfortunate thing is I don't think there is a lot being done about the compound itself. I mean, it's used in a lot of solvents and things like that. So in the preparation of tablets in the manufacturing process, it's leaked into the active ingredient to the point where by the time it gets to the patient, there's still trace amounts left. So, the unfortunate truth is there anything radical being done around NDMA? No, I don't think so. But manufacturers are starting to do things like go to other places. So, there's different sources.
They're in China mostly.
Mostly in China, but, when you look at a map of the world, there's sources all over the world. It's just that China is the cheapest.
What's your take on this?
Thanks, Libby. This is definitely something we need to watch. It speaks to kind of a broader manufacturing process. You asked about how does NDMA, nitrosodimethylamine, it sounds really chemical, and it is a chemical. It's a byproduct of a chemical processes in the manufacturing stages. And it actually has been identified as a component of rocket fuel, believe it or not. It sounds horrible, and it is a carcinogen. It's been recognized in animal studies and even human studies. That said, Health Canada has stated that it's still there's still significant safety, but they are recalling these products all the same because these are carcinogens. And I think each and every one of us need to be concerned about that. No one wants to be ingesting a carcinogen. I think it's Dean appropriately identified that this is part of the chemical process in terms of preparation of the pharmaceutical products that we use every day. The challenge that we face is that a lot of these products are sourced outside of Canada and therefore are outside of our regulatory process. Health Canada, even FDA in the United States, doesn't have
doesn't have a great reach into these other countries to effectively control the manufacturing process.
Well, yeah, that begs a question. But before we get to it, Dr. Gandhi, is this a problem in your practice? And I've talked to doctors who say, okay, the danger is over a lifetime of taking this, so why take these things off the market now when people need these medicines?
Yeah, and so you're quite correct. If you look up NDMA on the internet, it'll say all sorts of horrible things. It'll talk about being in rocket fuel and cancer causing. But what's really important to recognize is that it's the amount that's an issue. And the amount that was in a lot of these medications was very, very small. It was a very minute amount. And in fact, if you go around and check tap water, in many different cities, you'll find very trace amounts of NDMA. So the amount itself is very small. And it sort of begs the question of, is there a safe level of this compound? And I don't know that we have a true answer for that, and I believe that's why the regulatory authorities, what they've done is they've said, okay, out of an abundance of caution, they're going to pull these medications from the market. That has caused some issues in my practice. You know, there's common stomach drugs, ranitidine, famotidine, these are very common stomach drugs. We're having a lot of difficulty getting these drugs, and they're very, very good medication right now. So, but it is out of an abundance of caution.
Yeah, ranitidine, that's Zantac. And I know I sometimes take it over the counter, and it's not just the Zantac that was off the shelves, but after that, they said, what's the alternative is Pepcid? Well, try finding it in a pharmacy. Not so easy. So is the industry, I mean, is it just a matter that they want cheap ingredients, so they're going to China? Is it clear that the problem doesn't exist in other sources, or should we be producing that stuff here at home?
Yeah, well, that's a big question. First of all, it's not just China where some of the raw materials being sourced. There's other countries, India, for example, Brazil, what have you. There's lots of countries. I think one of the issues, the way I look at it from the work that I do, is if you look at drug regulatory systems and controls in a lot of countries, including developing countries and countries where we do get some of our sources from, this is a fragmented industry, there just isn't enough institutional capacity and human resource capacity, and this is a global problem. So when you have WHO has reported in the past, I don't know where it's at today, roughly 1 in 4 drug regulatory systems in the world are insufficient. That begs the question, why are we not investing more to help countries get their regulatory authorities up to snuff? And it's something that's not easy to argue. It's hard to kind of quantify. And investments are going into things that are tangible, like new hospitals or bed nets. And to say, oh, we want to invest in regulatory authorities doesn't get a lot of traction often.
Okay, when we come back, we'll take a look at drug shortages and what's being done to fix this ongoing problem. Stay tuned.
Physicians and pharmacists work very, very well together in managing these types of drug shortages.
Welcome back. According to the Canadian Pharmacists Association, an average of 5 new drug shortages are reported each day, and that is in the ordinary course of events. Now that COVID-19 is putting an added strain on the system, what is the risk going forward? And is the industry as a whole trying to reduce its reliance on China for many of the raw ingredients that are used in pharmaceuticals? Alan?
So I think it would be important for everyone to understand the components that go into the manufacture of the drug products we're talking about, and any drug product. When you actually think about a medication, the active ingredient actually really is a very, very small component of the tablet that you are going to take on a regular basis. The bulk of that tablet is consisting of a bunch of other raw materials, non-medicinal ingredients. These are binding agents that hold the tablet together. These are delivery systems that will help with absorption, but they're not going to be active ingredients themselves. So we have to delineate between the actual raw materials, the inerts, the non-medicinal components, and the active ingredient. What we're talking about here with regards to NDMA Those are coming from the raw materials, the inactive ingredients, the non-medicinal parts.
An example of one?
An example would be cornstarch. It would be lactose, coloring, the binding agents, polyethylene glycol. Yeah, there's a number of different ingredients that go to actually to make that tablet. If it was just the active ingredients, we'd be picking up our tablets with tweezers because you wouldn't actually be able to probably handle it.
And aren't there alternatives?
Well, there's a number of different drug delivery systems. There's capsules, there's tablets, there's different size tablets, there's just sustained release products. They're all delivering the same drug, but in a different way. But, the problematic piece right now is that we really don't know where this NDMA is coming from yet. So it still exists. There's problems out there in trying to say, hey, you know what? This one has it and this one doesn't. It's been highlighted big time in the last 6 months just because of the 3 meds that really were identified: the sartan drugs, ranitidine, and then just last week metformin. So very, very commonplace medications that, Dr. Gandy, you probably see in your practice numerous times
Yeah,
a day.
so these are, for patients who have hypertension, high blood pressure, and diabetes. I mean, I bet that's a majority of your practice.
Yeah, it's certainly a good portion of my practice. And as a result, it requires us to make some changes. One of the things that we're very fortunate about in Canada is that we do have a wide variety of different medication, and sometimes what you have to do is you'd have to change from one class of medicine. The sartan drugs that we were talking about, that's a blood pressure class of medicine. And it's not really possible to get a sartan drug right now in my area. So all different drugs in that class are gone. So thankfully in Canada, because we still have a reasonably robust supply of other drugs, we can compensate at the physician's office, but obviously it's something that we have to try and figure out a way to make sure we don't get into this problem.
Okay, what's involved when you try to put a patient from one drug to another or from one class to another? I mean, I know that with, something that wasn't that critical, I had to do that, and it turns out maybe the next one doesn't work as well as the first one, and then maybe the third one is better than the first one, but...
So the key thing is it requires more monitoring. So if I've got a patient who's stable on one drug, especially if it's a blood pressure drug, I probably won't need to see them for 6 months because I know they're stable and they're doing well. On the other hand, if I change their drug, I'm going to want to see them a month down the road, and that's a hassle for the patient. It's a hassle for me simply because I've got a busy practice, and if I don't need to see one, it's better that way. And then it becomes a situation where you're right, perhaps that new drug that I put them on doesn't work, which means I have to try something else and then see them again a month later. So
This is a great example of why physicians and pharmacists work very, very well together in managing these types of drug shortages. It's particularly when we're looking at a requirement to shift a patient from one drug to another because one drug is in back order or in short supply or it's been recalled. And the pharmacist is able to work in partnership with the prescribers to make sure that a recommendation can be made. Sometimes it's the pharmacist that's highlighting this for the prescriber, and I'm not saying in all cases, but in some cases, and a recommendation will be brought forward. It could be, hey, Dr. Gandy, one of your patients is on this particular sartan drug. This one's just been recalled. Recommendation might be to switch to this therapy at this dose. What do you think? And it is a hand in glove relationship that we have with physicians.
Well, it sounds very, very kind of labor intensive at a system level.
It is labor intensive, and also, I think you're assuming here that the option is there are alternatives. So I'm thinking about the EpiPen crisis, what happened. And so I'd like to speak a little bit more to kind of the larger issue here, which is who are we relying on for our essential medicines? So I think the fundamental problem here is we're relying on the private sector, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but we're relying on medicines that sometimes are essential for people's health and well-being and sometimes their lives. So the question is, do we need more government intervention?
And let's just remind people of the whole EpiPen situation where somebody came in and raised the price of an EpiPen by how many hundreds of %? Yeah. And he didn't care. Yeah. and there wasn't an alternative.
Yeah, and you see, children at pharmacies were being told, you don't have an EpiPen, and as any parent knows, or if any person needs it, this is a life-saving medicine. So it's not that we have an option here. So the question is this good enough? Can we just sit back and let this happen again? So I think there's a need for a real rethinking of how the system works.
Okay.
Well, the other thing that should be noted is that drug manufacturers, at least in the generic manufacturing world, have just gone through a process. So we've had a lot of cost cutting in that industry. They've just gone through what we call a SKU rationalization process. So companies that made 500, 600, 800 different medications in the past don't do that anymore, because they were just competing with each other, and now they're getting, I guess, a little smarter, and they're starting to say, hey, you know what, it makes no more sense for me to make this. I'm going to use one as an example. Apotex, one of Canada's largest drug manufacturers, makes a fraction, 1/3 of the medications that they made 5 years ago. That's a huge, huge shift in the availability of medications to Canadians.
So it's from a business model, it makes sense, but from a public health perspective, it doesn't.
Correct.
Okay, we'll get into that more later. And when we come back, we'll discuss cross-border shopping for prescription medications. That's next.
There just isn't enough supply of medications in the Canadian marketplace to also support the American market.
Welcome back. More and more Americans are crossing the border to buy drugs like insulin, which are vastly cheaper here. A $30 vial of insulin in Canada costs up to $450 in the U.S. Remember the caravan to a Windsor pharmacy led by Bernie Sanders last summer?
I still can't believe it. I paid $1,009 in U.S.
And isn't it a coincidence that we have three drug manufacturers, three insulin manufacturers, who control about 90% of the market? Isn't it just an amazing coincidence that the price hikes always take place at the same time and at the same level?
I was rationing insulin that I was getting for one child and sharing it between two.
I realized, looking back, why our power went out, why we weren't able to go on vacation, why we weren't able to do these things that other families were able to do.
Over the last 20 years, pharmaceutical industry has spent hundreds of millions of dollars on campaign contributions. They buy and sell politicians, Republicans and Democrats. In the last 20 years, they have spent billions of dollars on lobbying Congress to make sure that they can continue to charge the American people any price they want.
Meanwhile, the Trump administration is moving ahead with a plan that would allow states to import medications from Canada for the first time. Some of them are already doing it. Is our government doing enough to safeguard our drug supply? Jillian.
Well, I think the Trump move is really, it's optics. It's because he doesn't want to actually put price controls in the market. The U.S. is one of the few countries in the world that doesn't actually have price controls. That is a result of lobbying from the industry, which is one of the most resourceful industries. They don't have controls like we have here in Canada. The other point, though, I would have to say, though, is that consumers in the U.S. are also buying through the internet. So it's not necessarily just purchasing through here in Canada physically, which was probably more the case 15 years ago with the dollar exchange, et cetera, and the fact that we have controlled prices. But nowadays, you can just click online and you can get a drug. It may not be a safe drug. Hopefully you're you're using a certified website, which does exist. But the bottom line is it could be globally sourced today, not just from Canada.
Okay, but so here's the thing. A lot of people are saying, especially for people who live close to the border, is our government doing enough to safeguard our supply? Because I know the industry here is not happy about that.
Well, I think we haven't really noticed it yet in the little local pharmacy, in the border towns. But, if what is proposed happens, certainly a country like Canada with 2% of the global market really is not going to be able to service the needs of, states like California that, is as big as Canada. So, I mean, it's impossible. And, we have a lot of problems procuring medications on a regular basis. There's all kinds of allocations that go on of medications, and it's a tip-off that this might go into a shortage situation. But, sometimes a pharmacy will order 10 bottles of insulin, in the example we were using, and you get 5. So it's not always a secure supply, even for us in Canadian pharmacies.
We've had some conversations with pharmacists, particularly pharmacists at the border towns, and we recognize, it's very difficult. We're health professionals. We want to help patients, and we recognize the price differentials that exist. But to Dean's point, we are constantly trying to remind our members, pharmacists in Ontario, pharmacists right across Canada for that matter, that there just isn't enough supply of medications in the Canadian marketplace to also support the American market. The fact of the matter is that we need to make sure that we have enough medications for our residents right here in Canada, right here in Ontario. The Trump administration, there's legislation that's being proposed or passed. It's quite frankly, it's a little bit of rhetoric because they really don't have much control in a sense. Their laws don't really apply to our pharmacies or to our health system.
Yeah, but if there are people who are, that's on their end. From our end, we need people who will sell them the drugs. I mean, the question is it a problem?
And so the question that you asked is our government doing enough? So this falls in the purview of Health Canada. And I would have to say, no, Health Canada has not done enough to be proactive on this issue. At the beginning of the show, you listed a whole bunch of information about on the Health Canada website, you've got this many drug shortages and all that. Well, that's all nice and everything, but what's really needed is someone to be a little bit proactive. There's a medicine, I think it's Dilantin, correct me if I'm wrong, you guys would know, but Dilantin is 80% of the market is made by one company. So has anyone
What's
put
Dilantin?
It's an anti-seizure medicine for
Okay.
people who have seizures. So that means that the other 20% of Dilantin products are made by 3 or 4 other small pharmaceutical companies. Well, what happens? Has anyone at Health Canada thought about, well, what happens if there's some sort of event at the factory that the large pharmacy or the large pharmaceutical company has? And the answer to that is no. There's no proactive approach. There's just a listing of what's short. And I would have to say, unfortunately, that's not good enough.
So what should they be doing?
Well, here's a flashback to 30 years ago, and I'm going to say something that's probably unpopular. Looking back at having public producers of medicines. I mean, that has been the case in the 70s, very inefficient economically. I'm sure most people would say it doesn't fly, but maybe there's a new model that can go out there. Again, I'm going to go back to the point I made earlier. We're relying on market forces for public health needs. Market forces aren't perfect. They go where the profit motive is, so we're going to have slips. So I think it's time for the government to really sit back, prepare, do an assessment and try and figure out how do we incentivize the private sector to kind of fit our public health needs better, or do we have an alternative model in place?
Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's certainly an intriguing option. Certainly, status quo is not a recipe for success here. I think it's certainly a conversation topic to move forward. I think what we have been at least informed of, and I don't believe these are policies that have been truly enforced, is that manufacturers are supposed to maintain a residual amount in their supply, in their inventory, to cover in the event of back orders, in the event of shortages. There is supposed to be a minimum of 6 months supply so that if there is an interruption in the manufacturing process, that there's a 6-month buffer. As soon as you start interjecting Americans into our marketplace, all of a sudden that 6-month supply, that residual supply, is suddenly eaten up very, very quickly. And to your point,
Does it exist now, though?
In theory, on paper, it exists. I don't believe it's being enforced.
On the shelves, though, you don't know.
Not on the pharmacy shelves. Pharmacies can't.
So in the manufacturer's shelves?
In the manufacturer's shelves,
yeah,
absolutely.
What we're talking about here is that there used to be, and I mentioned it before, there used to be 5 different companies that would make the same medication. Now there might be 2. So what we're seeing in the pharmacy is that in your example, Dr. Gandy, if you had the primary producer or manufacturer or distributor of medication in Canada, something goes wrong, I almost guarantee it, that second supplier does not have the ability to meet the demand of the Canadian.
And if there is a second supplier.
If there is.
And that's where
And there
maybe the
not always is.
proactivity could happen, where the government's looking and saying, well, you know what, we're relying on one supplier for this basic medicine that's critical.
Right.
Maybe we need to think through incentives for other companies to come in the game, because I get worried when I hear your points about, which you're right, about the generic industry
take the
diving down.
tamoxifen issue of last month.
Oh, really?
Like that was, there's really only one person that makes it. And, you know, when we had a shortage, patients, and that one went right to the patient, right? And patients were scrambling around, phoning, you know, the Breast Cancer Society and stuff like, where do I get it? Where do I get it, right? So it's
were they moved off onto other drugs?
So tamoxifan's a tough one to go to a different way.
Well, so you get to a stronger aromatase inhibitor, I guess.
Well, yeah, but there's some issues with that. It's not an easy switch like it is for blood pressure, unfortunately.
He's on that drug for 5 years.
Pharmacies were asking us, you know, can we compound this from just the active ingredient and make it, in a sense, from scratch, where pharmacies actually become de facto manufacturers. It was getting to that level of seriousness in terms of supply. This is not a medication that you can just, you know, do without for, you know, and manage for a couple of weeks.
It's for people who've survived breast cancer.
Absolutely.
Very necessary. When we come back, we'll discuss whether Pharmacare is the answer. That's next.
So what you need on the government side from Health Canada is you need someone who's a strong negotiator who can get a good agreement for the citizens of this country.
Welcome back. For years, various health organizations, including CARP, have been calling on the federal government to implement a national Pharmacare program. Right now, Canada is the only country with a universal healthcare system that does not include coverage for prescription drugs. So would Pharmacare make the prescription drug problem better or worse? Who wants to start? Dr. Gandhi.
I think if Pharmacare is done properly, then there certainly is the ability for Pharmacare to do a better job of anticipating any issues with drugs. If you look at some countries in the European Union that have Pharmacare, they seem to do a much better job of supply chain management, or making sure that there's enough stockpiles of the medication that's required. The current plan, because as you know, the current government has proposed Pharmacare, I think the current plan unfortunately is substandard. I don't think it's a very well thought out plan, but I think that if done properly, there could be some benefit that way.
It's not clear that the plan is anywhere near a front kind of a burner.
Well, yeah.
But I've got to tell you, I've had meetings with pharmaceutical executives, and they say, okay, you know, when you talk about how it saves money in New Zealand, what's happening is that pharmas are stopping to produce certain drugs that aren't profitable enough, or they're making less of it, or not allocating it to our country. So is there a danger that it could make things worse?
I think that is a very real risk. I think we first have to all understand and come to, I guess, what is the definition of Pharmacare? What are we actually? Are we all talking the same thing? But I think your concern is well founded in that you look at other jurisdictions. It may sound from a fiscal perspective to be very attractive, but some of those countries, and you look at countries like New Zealand, the depth of the product mix in countries like New Zealand and others is not nearly what we have access. The number of products doesn't even come close to what Canada and the United States will have to offer. So you almost might be looking at a substandard list of medications on a national formulary.
I think that you know, what our plan was designed to do is to start off with some of the most common medications, and then leave the private sector doing, or private health plans doing the rest of it. You know, do you worry that if we move to Pharmacare, we could see more shortages because pharmas won't like the profit margin?
I mean, good points. First of all, I don't agree with the kind of race to the bottom with having a national formulary. I think it's critical. I think the industry typically does make that argument that because it's possibly less profit margins for them, that if we have less medicines, that is less care. I don't buy into that. I look at the WHO Essential Medicines List, which has been around since 1977, applied in over 180 countries. I have a colleague who works with me, Nav Persaud, Dr. Nav Persaud at the University of Toronto. He's proposing an Essential Medicines List for Canada, which could be considered under Pharmacare. Again, the details have not been worked out, but there's ways to move forward. So I actually think if we had a controlled Essential Medicines List, we would actually have a more sustainable drug supply.
Gillian, a question for you, because we have something in Canada called the Patented Medicines Review Board that sets the price of all brand drugs. Now, in 2020, in the midpoint of this year, they're going to start comparing Canada against different countries than they've had in the past. So our brand name prices are going to sink. The brand name manufacturers have already kind of gone on record that I won't have the ability, because of Canada's small market, to bring new medicines to this country, the innovative products. I'd just like your opinion on that.
Well, let's look back at history. When the Patent Medicine Prices Review Board was first formed in the early 90s, industry said the same thing. We still got the drugs. So I would say I'm not sure that's going to fly. Of course, time will tell. I don't know if it's a bluff. There might be some elements of truth to it, but I wouldn't take it at face value. I would say that's possibly not the end result. We have to wait and see. We've heard this before. It didn't pan out. We can wait again and see what the results are.
Because the big concern for pharmacies out there, not only the launch of new innovative drugs, it's also because in Canada, in every jurisdiction, the generic price is compared against the brand price. So as the brand price falls, the generic price falls. The profitability of pharmacy goes down, the profitability of manufacturers possibly goes down, and shortages continue to occur or get worse. So that's the big fear from a pharmacy perspective.
So let me ask you this, just bringing back a thread from a little earlier in this conversation. Would having Pharmacare make it easier for the government or whomever to get a better handle on these drug shortages, or make it worse?
Yeah, so if there's strong leadership, then absolutely, I think it would help if it's done properly. Like a lot of the comments that were made about how the drug companies have said, well, we might not bring new drugs, or talking about different prices, that's just part of the negotiation process. That's really what it amounts to, right? As ugly as it sounds, because it's healthcare and we're all passionate about healthcare, this is them opening up a negotiation. And so what you need on the government side from Health Canada is you need someone who's a strong negotiator who can get a good agreement for the citizens of this country.
Simple as that?
I wouldn't call it simple, Libby. We look at countries like New Zealand, where certain diabetes drugs that we take for granted here are just not available in New Zealand. And you're looking at very good therapies like metformin and glyburide for treatment of diabetes, but some of the newer diabetes products are just not available in that jurisdiction.
Okay. When we come back, we'll take some questions from the audience. That's next.
Is it fair to be charging such a high rate for life-saving medicines?
Welcome back. We'll now take questions from our audience, starting with Kathy. Hi, Kathy.
Hi. My original question was, why does it cost so much to manufacture some of these drugs? I have a friend who's living with cancer, and it costs her $3,000 a month for her cancer medication. How can it possibly cost that much to manufacture?
The process for manufacturing is incredibly complicated. So when a pharmaceutical company comes up with an idea for a new drug and they patent it, it's usually a minimum of 7 to 10 years at least before they come to market, because of all the regulations that are involved. And they're good regulations. There's good reason for all of them to make sure that their medications are safe. Some of the minerals that are used are extremely rare, and certainly some of the genetic drugs require very, very complicated processes. And then you have to pay for all the testing, which, as I mentioned, 7 to 10 years. There's a lot of legal applications. So cost of drugs goes up very, very quickly on some of them.
I'm going to give you a different take on that. I think that sometimes it's outrageous what the prices of drugs are. There is a lot of dispute in terms of the actual costs of research and development and what the industry does. I'm not saying that industry doesn't do great innovative drugs at times. It does. The question is, what are they actually predicting is their true cost? And there's a lot of opaqueness about that. We don't actually know. There's conflicting studies that show, there's lots of people who have done studies that determine that industry actually spends more money on marketing than it does on R&D. A lot of the R&D comes from public sector sources, so universities, like where I work, I have colleagues doing work. So the question is it fair to be charging such a high rate for life-saving medicines for an industry that we're not actually sure in terms of how much it actually costs?
Yeah, I mean, what are your options? I mean, you have to somehow come up with that money to pay for them, or you die.
Well, it speaks also, I think, to your earlier question, Libby, about Pharmacare and what the model is going to be. And about 85% of Canadians have at least some degree of coverage, and 15% don't have any coverage. So let's rather than the government of Canada and the provincial governments shouldering all of that cost as a single payer in a Pharmacare model, that sounds great. But it's going to be hugely impactful to every one of us as taxpayers, as patients. We are going to be covering a lot of those costs. Instead, why not leverage private sector drug plans and let the public plan for Pharmacare fill in the gaps?
Okay, you know what? In the case of a cancer drug, there's a ridiculous inequity in this country. Here in Ontario, the government pays for injectable chemotherapy. If it's a pill, you're on your own. And that's not the case in every other province. And to me, I just don't understand that at all. It's not a Pharmacare thing. It's a
well,
cancer care thing.
It could be a Pharmacare thing in that there's been a lot of talk around catastrophic drug coverage being looked at first. And I think those are the people that absolutely for economic reasons need the drug. Need it now, need it quickly, and I think if National Pharmacare can do anything in the short term, it's that.
Okay. I hope that sort of answers your question. Thank you very much, Kathy. Complicated. Okay, Michael, you're next. What's your question, please?
Yes, my question sort of follows along that line. Here in Ontario for seniors, we have a type of Pharmacare where for a lot of drugs, there's a small copay, and then the government pays the rest. But as newer drugs come along, they're not covered. And it seems to take forever till they get on the formulary.
I don't know if there's a one good reason to say, hey, this is the magic bullet and this is how it gets on the formulary faster, but certainly collaboration between advances in care that is coming and a formulary, I don't think that exists today at all. So
well, there's a committee, right? And it only meets when it meets, and it takes its time.
But I would argue that you need to be very careful not to assume that a new drug is necessarily a better drug. So we do have checks and balances in place, particularly in Ontario, in terms of looking at the therapeutic benefits of a new drug versus an existing molecule. So be careful, because yes, indeed, sometimes there are advances and innovations that really do make a difference, but a lot of times that is not the case. So I would say sit back, look at it, talk to your doctor, talk to other people, read the literature, and really determine if this innovative drug matters for you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
When we come back, final thoughts from our panelists. That's next.
Don't forget, for free tickets to the show, go to www.universe.com and search Zoomer Media, and log on to www.thezoomertv.com for full episodes and more.
Welcome back to the Zoomer. It's now time for final thoughts from our panelists, starting to my left.
You are not alone, and you need to know that pharmacists working very closely with prescribers are working to make sure that continuity of care is top of mind. It's absolutely important. We know that there are a variety of factors that are going to impact Canadian drug supply. I think pharmacists and physicians are well equipped to manage the drug supply and make sure you have the care you need.
My organization, we talk with manufacturers all the time, specifically in the generic industry. And we've just finished speaking and meeting with all of them. The unfortunate truth is that they've all said the same thing. You think it's bad now, it's going to get worse. Whether it be COVID-19, disruption of the supply out of China or India or Taiwan or wherever. But so it's something we all have to be aware of. I wish I had good news to say, you know what, we've gone through a bad time and we're through it now. But unfortunately, I don't think we're through it.
I'm going to say we can make a change. And you can make a change by demanding more transparency and accountability in terms of your pharmaceutical supply, demanding a Pharma Care from the government, which would ideally help control some of our supply issues. I think the current model is not sustainable, where we sit back and we just say, let the private sector take care of our public health needs. That doesn't work. The government is involved. Maybe it needs to get more involved. Maybe we need to have different incentive structures in place. But I would say each and every one of you can advocate to your MP, to your doctor, to whoever, that you need to have a change.
Yeah, I would second what Dr. Kohler says. I think, as I mentioned earlier, this is something that Health Canada is responsible for. Health Canada is supposed to look at the national drug supply. I do not believe they've been as proactive as they need to be. And I think that as situations occur, because we never know what the future holds, I think it's really important for them to be very, very proactive. I do believe that the Pharmacare proposal that's being made by the current government is not adequate. I don't think it's a good proposal. I think that it needs to be revamped to consider how you look at supply chain management for the safety of all Canadians.
Okay. Well, let's hope that we find a solution to this problem. In the meantime, do be prepared. This isn't going away. Thank you for being with us. We'll see you soon. It's time to zoom out.